This is called And to Those Left Behind, which has sort of started off as a joke, but then became the theme of my presentation because it seemed to work quite well. But actually, it's about a whole load of issues around the ways that we create art and culture, what the shape of art and culture is, and what this troubling word digital might mean in a reality in which all words have complicated meanings and are hard to pin down. And so I wanted to start by saying that when I mean those left behind, I'm not talking about some sort of event in which people who are offline will sort of stop being more important. And Imran and I were talking about this earlier, and he coined the phrase, he said it's like the rapture. You know, you could think about it as if we're all about to be taken into geek heaven, which is fantastic, and then there'll be 7 years of fighting here on Earth, and then it will be the end of creation. You know, which is, a reasonable speculation, because some of the people who talk about getting everybody online and race online and stuff like that do have a certain degree of religious fervour about it, and I don't think that's necessarily appropriate, as I will be exploring. So we talked about that a bit earlier today, and then literally, as I was sitting down over there at the wrap-up of the last presentation, reading through Twitter, as you do, because newspapers are so 20th century, this tweet came up from William Gibson. Could somebody give me a pill for Kurzweil singularity? Oh, you mean the geek rapture. So I thought clearly synchronicity meant I had to mention it, because if William Gibson, one of the inspirations for so much of my thought, is thinking about geek rapture at this precise moment, joy of Twitter, then I should be too. But it's not actually what I wanted to talk about, so let's move back from that. What I wanted to talk about are the stories that we tell ourselves. Joan Didion, the great American essayist and writer, in the introduction to her essays, The White Album, collected as The White Album, wrote, "We tell ourselves stories in order to live. The princess is caged in the consulate. The man with the candy will lead the children into the sea." And she went on to talk about how every writer is selling someone out, about the stories that we tell become infinitely important, because the stories are what create, in the narratives, sense in our lives. The stories are the threads that allow us in this complicated existence to make some sense of the world. And sometimes it doesn't matter if the story is true. Indeed, you could argue that no stories are true because we have no good concept of what truth might be in an absolute sense. So in the park around the corner, just at lunchtime, I photographed the statue of Alan Turing clutching his apple. And it goes to pains in the little plaque next to it in Sackville Street to debunk the story that Apple computers were named because of the poisoned apple that Turing used to kill himself, pointing out that Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak worked on an apple farm. And I thought it was interesting that they went to that effort to destroy what was actually quite a nice myth. I did wonder whether Apple's lawyers had been involved, because, they do get everywhere these days, but that's probably unlikely. But the stories matter. The stories matter because they hold things together. And in thinking about the impact of digital culture, of digital technologies on our lives, which is, of course, the big theme of these few days, we need to think about more than just getting people online. We need to think about more than just Martha Lane Fox and her Race Online 2012, important though it is. We need to think about more than just fast fibre into every building and 4G networks, important though they are, because they are at best enabling factors for a much bigger change that's happening in terms of the ways we live our lives and the ways we construct ourselves as people around those stories. I'm a big fan of Ludwig Wittgenstein. I'm lucky enough to have been taught by Elizabeth Anscombe, who translated Philosophical Investigations into English. So I go back almost to Wittgenstein. I am that old. And I'm a great admirer of his philosophy because it asks hard questions. And I know it doesn't give very many answers, but that's fine with me. And in particular, Wittgenstein asks us to reflect on the meaning of a word and how words are located within environments, within what he calls language games, and how those language games are difficult to understand from the outside. And so I want to ask the question today in the context of Future Everything, both the conference and the art and the music and the exhibitions and the technology on show, that if the shape of our culture is changing as much as it seems to be from everything we see around us and from the ways we live our lives today, then what does the word art mean? If the language game has shifted around us, but we're still using the same vocabulary, isn't it time to ask a serious question about the location of some of the most important words in our cultural activity? And start to disentangle the old meanings from the new possibilities in a way that can liberate our creative expression, can place art at the centre of the broader culture, and can give us some clues, perhaps some guidance as to where we might want to go next. So what I'm thinking about is the meaning of what we're all doing here. You know, why are we here? Okay? Not just because Manchester's a nice place to visit, not just because Drew wanted us here. Why are we here in that broader sense? Now, there are some clear themes drawn out. If you take the time to look through all of the material about what's happening at Future Everything, you can see the very big themes, and they're really quite important ones. Data. The idea of data, of the ones and the zeros, the bits of the digitized culture, and access to that data. Openness and availability is absolutely central to so much of what people have been talking about and so much of the work that's being done, so much of the very good work that's being done. But also, interestingly, it's increasingly about visualizations rather than essays. Now, I think through words, I think by writing things down, and have nothing but respect and admiration for someone who can look at a problem space and imagine it represented visually, and then delve into raw data and create something which is a thing of beauty, but also is instructional, which represents that data in a form that can be used and can be made sense of. Books used to be the main machines for moving ideas around in society. But a lot of the work in the open data movement, particularly with mapping and other visualizations, implies to me that other tools are becoming available, and they have nothing to do with words on paper or e-ink or screens. And that's something which I think we need to think about. There's also technology disappearing from view, like magic does. Arthur C. Clarke used to say that good technology is like any sufficiently advanced technology is like magic. That, of course, was wrong and fatuous, because any sufficiently advanced technology is invisible. And what we're seeing, again, more and more, are technologies that become environments, that become spaces within which we operate, rather than things that we use. So this is Hills Are Evil, one of the iShared sponsored services that tries to map a city in order to help people who are wheelchair-bound get around. And it's overlaying a map with some data, a visualization, but it's also starting to change the environment, starting to change the way people feel about their interactions with the technology. You don't see the technology, you see the environment. Another big aspect that we've seen coming through over the few days has been about the maker approach, that hackers are returning to the physical. Don't forget, the hackers started off as the MIT Model Railway Club, and they were hacking railway layouts and sort of zero gauge engines and stuff like that. Well, now the makers are hackers in the physical world again. And something else which came up on Twitter today was a reference to this. It's called the HomeSense Bike Map. This is a little Arduino-based hack that uses the data about the London cycle scheme and a little display of the locality to show which nearby bike racks have more than 5 cycles on them. So you can tell at a glance as you leave your house which way to go to pick up a London cycle. You don't need to log on to anything, you don't need to get anything out of your pocket, you don't need to interface with anything. It just sits there, ideally on the wall by the front door. You look at it, you move on. The technology serves your purposes instead of you having to figure out how to interface with the technology. And that return, if you like, to the real world after hacking's brief sojourn in the virtual strikes me as a very important development and something that not only needs to be encouraged, but needs to be fully acknowledged. It's part of the growing understanding that we don't live in a digital world, that we were never going to anyway, but calling this a digital world or a digital age is just foolish, because we are as located in the real as we ever were, as physical objects, bodies, engaging with other physical objects, people and things. And whilst most of the data we deal with on a day-to-day basis is now digital, ones and zeros, or has been at some time digital, every book you read, every newspaper you look at, every television program or film you see has had some form of digital processing, the world is not itself digital. It is a digital culture. This, of course, is something that musicians and artists have always understood. People like Peter Gregson, the cellist here, Peter uses his cello as an input device for his Mac. Okay, he plays the cello, but primarily he uses it as an input device for his Mac. But what comes out are sounds, are vibrations of atoms in the real world to be experienced in the real world through our ears by people. He does not see himself as operating in a virtual space. If anything, what's happened is the liminal space between the digital, virtual, and the real physical has grown to encompass everything. That this very narrow space that we carved out 30 years ago when the internet was turned on, 60 years ago when we built the first digital computers, 25 years ago when the Mac appeared, 5 years ago when we got our iPhones, this narrow space between the real and the virtual has become the space within which those of us who are lucky enough to live in advanced Western economies where we have affordable access to broadband and can afford the latest smartphones and mobile phones, those of us who are lucky enough to be there now live always within that space. And that itself has some interesting implications. I was talking to Julian Tate and Adrian Slatcher just first thing this morning about going on holiday, as you do, and the joy of not being online for a few days, Adrian said. And we reflected on this for a bit. And of course, it depends how you think about going offline. Because my model of consciousness, of what's happening in my conscious mind, is very much a systems model in which there are competing subsystems, and my consciousness, the thread of conscious thought that I have through the day, is really just a narrative constructed by the dominant subsystem at any one time to try to make sense of the chaos of existence. I don't know, you probably all feel like that. Okay, it's just me then. Anyway, even if it's just me, existence is chaotic, there are all these subsystems. Some of the parts of me that are always thinking, but are not necessarily always conscious, are always online, are attached to things that are happening in the virtual space, whether it's Twitter, Facebook status, and understanding, God, even thinking about whether my web server's down or not, you know, is Apache running efficiently? There are parts of my consciousness that are always engaged with that, though they are not always dominant. To go offline, therefore, is essentially to cut off parts of my mind, is deliberately to decide to use less than my full faculty when I'm thinking, because those parts are fully integrated. Why would anyone want to do that? Well, I suppose it's the equivalent of taking some serious hallucinogens, so many of us probably would want to do that, but we should at least know what we're doing when we get into this dangerous business of going offline. So I'm with Nancy Reagan on this. Just say no to offline existence. Given that it's not a digital world, given that it's a world in which we engage with digital technologies and digital data and all these tools, but still exist as physical human beings, what is going on? What have systems like this done to us? This is EDSAC. It was one of the world's very first digital computers. I didn't actually have a photograph to hand of Atlas, which is the computer being built at the same time in Manchester, but Manchester and Cambridge, where I live now, are the places where stored program digital computers on the John von Neumann model came into existence, where the modern world started. And we are living with the consequences of that. And those consequences, I think, are quite enormous for us all. In fact, I think we have to go back quite a long way before we can start to understand just how much impact these digital technologies are likely to have. Not to Gutenberg and printing. The invention of movable type was important, but I don't think it counts in this particular calculus. I think we need to go back to the period before writing, 7,000, 8,000 years ago. As writing began, things started to shift in the way human beings work. The invention of writing, the ability to write, was phenomenally important because it allowed the processes of thinking, the processes of mind, to be captured and preserved outside an oral tradition. Think about it. 10,000 years ago, if there was a word that was in use among a tribe of humans and everybody forgot that word, then it was as if it had never existed. Do any of you here play the game? Do you know about the game? So, the game is a game in which the point about the game is to forget you're playing the game. When you've forgotten you're playing the game, you're no longer playing the game. When everyone has forgotten they're playing the game is over. At the point at which the game is over, no one remembers the game was ever played. Because if you remember you were playing the game is not yet over. You're now all playing the game, by the way. Welcome to hell. And every now and then someone will say the game in a perfectly innocent context, and you'll go, oh, fuck. Okay, that's it for the rest of your life. Unless you all forget, in which case the game is over and we'll have won something. Well, all of language was like the game. If a word was forgotten, it was forgotten. The ability to capture those words enabled almost everything. It also changed us enormously. And that is such a fantastically important revolution. To go from this to the alphabet to the literate culture we have today was an astonishing revolution. And revolutions that big don't happen very often. And I think one's happening now. But more importantly, revolutions that big leave their mark. This book, Proust and the Squid, by Marianne Wolf, is a study of dyslexia and what lies behind dyslexia, the inability to read coherently. And Wolf argues, to me very convincingly, based on a whole load of neurophysiological evidence, that learning to read changes your brain. That teaching someone to read is doing brain surgery without a scalpel. That in order to go from recognizing letter shapes, to seeing words, to abstracting meaning, to fluent reading, in which you're extracting meaning and thinking about what you're reading while you continue to read, we need to put parts of the brain that evolved for completely different purposes to use in new ways, and we need to link them together in new ways. And her evidence is that teaching someone to read rewires the brain. It creates new pathways, particularly between the hindbrain and the cortex, that allow some areas of the brain that do very, very fast pattern recognition. She speculates, but it's a bit sort of evolutionary biology-ish, that these are to do with predator recognition. Maybe, maybe not. I'm not going to go down that way. I've had enough neo-Darwinist claptrap thrown at me over the years. But anyway, she speculates about that. But certainly parts of the brain that are very good at pattern recognition are used to identify letter shapes and words and throw them to the cortex where meaning can be abstracted by the language areas. It's a good, compelling argument. I recommend the book. If this is the case, that the reading brain works differently, I see no reason why digital tools should not also be having an effect on the way our brains are wired up. But unlike Baroness Susan Greenfield, I'm not scared of this. Nor am I going to write mad articles for the Daily Mail about it, I promise. I just think it is highly likely that we use these tools, we use these technologies, and they change the way, not that we think, but the way our brains work, and hence the way we think. And the stuff that I was talking about earlier about the importance of visualizations, about the way technologies disappear from view, about the digital environments that we are constructing, all will support and sustain those changes in the way we construct reality, and hence in the way language relates to that perceived reality. Now, this has a really significant implication for the people who are not particularly digitally literate. In a pre-literate culture, in a society before written language, illiteracy doesn't exist as a concept. What does it mean to be illiterate when there are no written words? It doesn't mean anything. But as cultures become increasingly dependent on literacy, on writing, to support and sustain themselves, to create written records, to enhance and maintain the power structures, to give the priests and the monarchs and the merchants and whoever else power and authority, so lacking literacy becomes an issue. I once stood up at a conference of book publishers who were whinging about how bad things were for them, and I pointed out that they were the only industry in the world where governments were spending billions of dollars every year just to create their market, so they should just shut up and be grateful. I did manage to escape the stage. But it's true that we invest enormous amounts of time and effort trying to ensure that everyone can read and write. And there's a reason for that, because not being able to read and write excludes you in a very deep level. If you can afford books, fine, but if you can't read them or benefit from them, you're in trouble. Of course, if you can't read road signs, you may not be around long enough to have the problem about not being able to read books. Separate issue. So books did something to society and have become central. The idea of reading. In a literate society, we create cathedrals, we then create libraries to store them. We have a literate tradition that goes on and on and on. As we move into a digital culture, the shapes of the potential problems also changes as well. That until relatively recent, not using computers, not understanding computers, having no interest in digital art, not knowing what was going on here, was not a problem, and indeed it put you in the majority. That, I think, has changed. Not is changing, I think it's already changed. I think we're past the point. I think that analog thinking, being unable to appreciate what digital tools can do, being unable or unwilling to see what the network brings, has now become a problem. It's clearly become a problem in the UK over the past few weeks for the entire judicial system and most of the politicians. I was going to put up the super injunction slide now, but you can all see it later. It's not that interesting. It's a bunch of people you don't really care about doing other things with people you don't really care about either. But the point is, it can't be stopped. So that's just one small example. The issues within the arts funding sector, within the subsidised arts world, about what to do about digital art and how to get digital skills into the arts world, are another example where there are large numbers of people who are in the midst of the transition. I hope they're in the midst of the transition, because if they're not, there's going to be even more trouble in a few years' time, to thinking digitally and abandoning their analog sensibilities. And I do believe they don't have a choice. I was in Dublin on Monday, and I went to the Dublin Writers' Museum, and this was one of the artefacts. This is Samuel Beckett's telephone. It was the one from his Paris apartment. It has a red button and a green button. When you press the red button, it doesn't receive incoming calls. When you press the green button, it does. If you knew when Sam was willing to take incoming calls, you could phone him, and there was a chance he'd answer if he wasn't feeling like he was being awkward. At all other times, you were cut off. There are too many people who believe that they can have Samuel Beckett's telephone, who think that they can just keep the red button depressed and they will not be bothered by the digital culture around them. And they are so wrong. They are so very wrong. For a while I've been saying to people, been quoting George Santayana, those who don't understand the past are condemned to repeat it, and I've been saying, if you don't build a future, you have to live in someone else's. On the way here from my hotel this morning, I saw this poster, which expresses it much better than I can. If you don't design the future, someone else will. And that future will be designed with digital tools. It will be designed to make best use of the affordances of the internet, of high-speed distribution, of digital content, which can be perfectly copied, where DRM is recognized for the farce it is. That will be the world, and we will all be living in it. Because the main point is, to all of you in this room, we won. We actually did it. Over the past 20 years, we have defined a new culture. It is the digital culture. It's the one some of us have been talking about for so long. It's the one we've all been working to build, and it is now the dominant culture. The game is over. We have our victory. We can now march out of here. The world is ours. If you ask me what that actually means, if it means what are we going to do, I don't know. It's like saying, hey, we've invented the alphabet. I wonder what impact it'll have. Okay? I am not going to predict Fontworks and Neville Brody's fuse 7,500 years down the line. But I am going to predict in all confidence that the cultural shift has happened, it will be increasingly acknowledged, and this change will continue. And the only thing we can really do about it is to indulge in a very large-scale action research program that I'd like to call Living Our Lives. And I suggest we all seek funding for that from whatever sources we can. Thank you.
I think we have 5 minutes for questions, if anybody wants to put anything to Bill. Do we have a mic somewhere? Good. Actually, Ian, you can jump in. That's cool. You're at the front anyway. Guy in the hat there. Thanks.
Ian.
Right there.
We're good, Mr. Forrester.
Hello? Okay, great. I know I've been asking questions, but I was literally laughing inside through the whole of this. I'm actually dyslexic, and the way I perceive the world is quite different from you guys, the rest of you guys. And sometimes I fundamentally don't understand some of the things, some of the ways you kind of get to things. And I think, as you pointed out, this is, we've won, and so it's like I could go back to my school teacher and say, yes, you know what, there will be there's a calculator in my pocket. That's the way I do things.
Yep.
I use Kindle and whatever, and that's the way I'll do things, and that's and you have to live in that world.
Yes.
And they'll turn around and go, no, we will fight it. So, although I feel we've won,
yep,
I'm waiting for the backlash.
Mm-hmm.
How do you feel we will compete against that backlash?
Well, we have an advantage, which is that the things that the network makes possible for people in their ordinary lives are things they want. The bigger implications, the battle is taking place with the content industry. It's taking place with the politicians. It's not taking place with ordinary people. And so I think as long as those of us who are deeply engaged in digital culture and technologies remember their needs and make sure that as the avant-garde we engage with the proletariat, then this revolution will not be undone by the bourgeoisie of the analog world. Come on. Indulge me, it's the end of the day.
So, somebody at the front.
There's a question here at the front. Who's got the mic?
Is it on? Yeah, it is.
All right.
On that, I kind of agree with what you just said. But
you better agree. If you don't agree, you're out the window. It's a revolution.
And I agree on a macro level, we shouldn't and we can't press the red button. But on a micro level, I think there could be a talk called, those of us trapped within. Because I have a big project going on with myself. I have to learn how to switch off in order to deep focus, but I can't. Because technology has got its grip on me now. So I think, we're in this digital world, and it should and it does work for us, but not all the time. And I have a lot of colleagues I work with that really should have a project going on with themselves because they're unable to focus for 15 minutes, You get interrupted by technology all the time, and for some reason, we can't switch off. You can't go into a room and leave the...
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean... I like the idea of locked into technology syndrome. It's like sort of a comatose state because it does feel like that sometimes. I've read was it Stephen Berlin's book? Yeah? I can't remember whose book it was now, about does Google make us stupid? Up to a point. I think more that there is this transition going on, and those of us who grew up with analog ways of working still find it quite hard. I know I do. But I don't think, and this is why I reflected on how are these technologies changing the brain, I'm not sure that the same problems will arise. Just as once you can read fluently, it becomes impossible not to see words in languages you know. So I think there will be a stage we go through where integrating the digital feeds and information into your consciousness and disregarding them will become a form of fluency. But that's me being optimistic. And ask me again in 5 years when we're both in psychiatric hospital because of information overload.
Well, thank you, Bill. That was a thrilling coda to the conference and exactly what we wanted to achieve. So
Thank you.
thank you for that.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.